Welcome to Raven Talk, the official podcast of the Raven Tribe. The Raven Tribe is a home for warriors on the path, and is dedicated to training warriors for the battlefield of life. Visit us on the web at theraventribe.com, where you can learn more information on membership, warrior training, as well as links to our official YouTube channel, Facebook group, apparel store, and our official bookstore, Marshall Books.
Welcome back, Tribe. Today we're here with special guest, Guru Sean Stark. Sean, how are you doing today?
Really good, thank you.
Great. Well, Sean, it's great to have you on. For the audience at home, Sean, I always like to start the show off and ask the guests to tell us a little bit about themselves, where they got started in the martial arts, and what they've done that's brought them up to this point in their career. So if you wouldn't mind, can you give us a little bit of insight and background into how you got started?
Sure, yeah. I had always been interested. I grew up with an interest in things military and combative and all of that. And so I don't know if that's too different from most boys, but, cowboys and Indians, everything you can imagine, I was into it. I liked it, and it always intrigued me. And so I kind of pursued all of those things in the best way that I could as a kid growing up. And that led me to certain people who basically had training and were willing to share it with me. My parents were divorced when I was fairly young, and so financially I was never able to take official classes while I was growing up, and so that's kind of been one of my things that I try to do, is to make it available to people. And anyway, so I just started by kind of consistently pursuing it, at least in spirit. If not, I would literally volunteer to fight people. I know that sounds ridiculous, but as a young kid, 10, 12 years old, I was fighting 16-year-old kids just because. Somebody would be like, "Hey, why don't you fight them?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, okay," and a really goofy thing to do, not really in the martial mindsets at all, but it probably was part of me trying to fit in and all that other stuff that you do as kids. But so I've always kind of pursued it in one form or another.
Now, Sean, you have come to be very well known for your involvement in the martial art of Silat, and saying the martial art of Silat is a little bit incorrect, because there's dozens and probably hundreds of different variations of Silat, but that's kind of where you've made your home. Can you tell me a little bit about what had caught your eye about Silat? What made you gravitate in that direction?
Sure. Yeah, I started off, officially started off in Taekwondo, and that was peer training. I had a friend who was studying, and so he would teach me stuff, and, it was kind of a Saturday afternoon kind of thing. And that was cool, but I got interrupted by graduation and all that stuff. So then I went off into the Army, became military police, and of course I was pretty interested in combatives at that point. So I began studying Aikido at a local club on the military base, and that led me to kind of a continued interest in it, and I pursued that Aikido mix and Judo after I got out of the Army, and I spent some time in school. I met a guy who taught Kung Fu along with Tai Chi. It was more of a soft cotton style, and so then I went through and studied with him, and he also was familiar with Aikido, so I continued to get a little bit of that fix. And what I ended up really sort of enjoying was Tai Chi, because I could sort of process the movements differently. There wasn't, at that time anyway, a lot coming out of anywhere about the combative side of Tai Chi, so it was a lot more exploration for me, which I enjoy. And my teacher, we worked a lot on push hands and spear and things like that. So it got to the point where I was pursuing other teachers, and then I actually relocated away from him and didn't have him as a teacher after several years. And so I kind of was looking around. I started teaching my own classes at that time in the Kung Fu and the Tai Chi, and that just brought other people around, to see what I was doing, what I was about, and then that led to study of Masalindo and Kali, JKD, and that introduced me to Bach Sheldon, Ying Jiao Pai, and it just sort of progressed quite a long list of stuff, and I was kind of pursuing multiple things at the same time, and most things I studied for a minimum of a year, usually multiple 2-3 years at least, and I got to this place where I was not really progressing. I was doing a lot, but I wasn't progressing, and I found myself gravitating more and more to simpler ideas. And at that time, it was Kali and the Masalindo. And so, at the time, the teacher who was teaching me, showing me that stuff, was also teaching me a Kuntao system called Hakun. And so I was really pursuing that because that was also very small, kind of directly relatable to some of the Kung Fu practice I had been experiencing, and so I understood it. It's kind of hard to explain in a linear way because it didn't happen in a linear way. I feel like it was kind of the exposure to all these different things that sort of led me to Silat, and it was this moment when you're studying, it wasn't really Masalindo that tripped my trigger, although I liked it. It wasn't that. It was really when I started studying Sturlock and Pomor, and I got introduced to Jati Bastesa, that I saw something that had been missing in all the other aspects and of martial arts that I've been training. And it's kind of difficult to explain, but I always refer to it as rasa, as a sort of movement with intent, but the movement isn't just moving, it sort of has a particular character to it. And it resonated with me because it was sort of this art that, at least the ones that I had been exposed to, combined the pursuit of weapons and takedowns, and you could do joint locks if you were into that, or you could do basic hitting, but it also had this sort of beautiful movement, which I'd come to appreciate in Tai Chi as, having value not just from beauty's standpoint, but also from application. So Silat to me was sort of this culmination of all these things in one system, and it allowed me in another facet. I'm an artist by birth, I guess. Went to school for art, and so it also had this component to it that was pretty organic and allowed for a lot of exploration and evaluation. And it also appealed to my sense of order and I guess a need to organize things. That's who I am. I like things to make sense, and I like them to have value. And so when you give me something that's kind of a mess, my first thing is to try to organize it. And so Silat to me was this kind of a beautiful mess of application and destruction and beauty and all that stuff, movements all rolled into one thing. It's really just allowed me to sort of open up and explore all these different facets.
Now, Sean, at one point in your training, you decided to take the step forward and to create your own curriculum and your own system.
Yeah.
I want to know a little bit about that. First, I'd like to ask what prompted you to create something, distinct. Why didn't you choose to pursue one of the, many, versions of Silat that are available? And once you did decide to create your own system, what were some of the goals that you initially had? What were some of the motivations for doing so?
Sure. So the first part is, how did I come to it, or why did I come to it? And the bottom line was that I was, again, studying all these systems, and I was doing a lot of fighting at the time. I ended up meeting a good friend of mine, Hugo, is his nickname, and he was a Shoei Ryu practitioner, and at the time he was doing a lot of training, 6 hours a day kind of thing, and he's a fairly large guy, and so when I met him, I was still doing kung fu and all that. I'd fight him, and I just found myself to feel like, man, all the training I'm doing, and I'm just not as functional as I imagined I would be, right? Like, there's something that in the martial arts that, we look at ourselves as the protagonist who's always winning, and the reason is because we train that way. And so, I meet this guy who obviously wasn't going to have that because he was his own protagonist, and so, I was summarily thumped multiple times, and I thought, man, the tiger system of Kung Fu is not working for me, the monkey's not working for me, the train's not working for me, and I went through all these processes, and when I got into Silat, I started to see some of that change. Now, it's still a matter of that process, and so that's part of the reason why I went into Silat, was that it allowed me to focus more, and it helped me to actually become more focused on sort of a specific set of movements. And I think you could do that with karate or whatever, but for me it was Silat that resonated, so that's why I did it. And in that process of studying Silat, I immediately, because this is my mode of operation, I immediately took on multiple systems of Silat, and thinking, well, if one's good, four is better, and trying to went at it. And I ran into some of the same things with Silat, which was that, hey, some of these systems are cool and they have a lot of cool stuff in them, and I feel like it's applicable, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't really resonate with my experience fighting. And in particular, our culture of fighting here in the U.S. And it was my experience, actually, that in Silat, as, I had time to train even in Indonesia a little bit. And while I was there, I got the opportunity to study Jati Sesa, which is, my teachers are now teaching Silat Sunda, is what they're calling it. But it was interesting because those teachers all performed it differently, to the point where I wasn't, being the young person in that art, I didn't always even recognize the similarities. That's how different it was. And, I was told, well, it's kind of your own expression. It depends what you want to highlight, how you want to move through the motions. And philosophically, to me, that meant that, oh, well, okay, I get that I can change any particular motion, but that also means that I should continue to be adaptable. And it also means then that I should be adapting to life here in the U.S. And, not many of us walk around wearing a sarong, for example. So for me, the initial pursuit was to bring Pencak Silat here to the U.S. in a way that makes sense with U.S. culture, not just mimic the Indonesian methods for the sake of Indonesian methods. Because to me, that would be a failure of adaptability, which is one of the primary things you learn in Silat. And so that was a big component for me to step away from traditional systems. In addition, I look at things like, how long does it take an average person to be good at any kind of martial art, let alone a Silat system? And the reality is it takes a long time for most of us, and the other reality is that most of us don't have that much time. So, how do I make a martial art be attainable in a relatively short amount of time, given that, we maybe train 2-3 hours a week, 4 hours a week, I don't know. Maybe you train more than that, but the majority of people that I've worked with, including myself, don't always train that much. So how do you get somebody from A to Z in that time frame and give them something that, again, is applicable here in the U.S., where you have headhunters, where you have guys who are 250 pounds, on average, I'm guessing, of course, and 6 foot tall, but, just kind of how do you fit the frame of a American person or a Western person and still do Silat, as opposed to trying to get guys my size to do a no-handed cartwheel, which is one of the things that was a harm of yours that I could do the one-handed and the two-handed, but the no-handed wasn't going to happen anytime soon. And you start to look at those things, so is it really worth that effort to do that? And so, part of my process in studying new art was to really just look at what is effective, what is simple, what makes it approachable, what makes it attainable for the average person. If the average person is going to be with me 2 to 3 years before a life event takes them away, then, how do I get them the most, in that amount of time and deal with attacks and types of attacks that we are used to seeing here in the U.S. So, that's a big part. And then I had some really kind of unfortunate experiences with a lot of the martial politics that was a big impetus in me wanting to step away from specific styles. Not because the styles were bad. I just didn't want to waste time with politics and all of that. So I went around and asked all of my teachers if I could, go ahead and start something, and got their permission to do so, and to give credit where credit was due, and that sort of thing. That's the basics.
Now, Sean, let me ask you, when creating a curriculum, it can be challenging, and you kind of gave us some insight as to why you decided to do it, and I'm curious to know, on a mechanical level, what you looked at as, the more important elements of what you wanted to teach. How did you weight the value of all the, combined information that you had gathered from these different instructors? I understand you wanted to make something a little bit more adaptable for the American culture, kind of for our frames and our way of doing things. But, again, Silat is so diverse, and there's systems of Silat that are, very heavily reliant on striking techniques, others on, takedowns and manipulations. Some are, ground systems, some are standing systems. So where did you start to do that? Because I can only imagine that would be a monstrous task to start to, filter the physical components and the nuts and bolts of what you need to teach a student to give them a good foundation. So how did you tackle that?
Well, so it's interesting, right? Like it's an interesting question the way it's posed, because that isn't even like the way that I thought about it. I didn't look at what I was taught. I looked at what was working and what wasn't working. And so and part of that was, I have to step back a little bit. I essentially created, I hate that term because I didn't really do much. I just had the framework show up. But anyway, the framework of PSP essentially came to me in a few weeks' time. I was studying for more, and doing a lot of fighting, and my friend Hugo and I, we would go back and forth. We'd beat each other up every, 3 months or something. We'd get together. We lived in separate towns at the time, and we would come back together and we would have these long philosophical, discussions after an hour and a half of beating each other stupid and breaking things. And, we would have these discussions, and he was a perfect sounding board because he would often be contrary just to be contrary. And so you would get these discussions that cause you to think differently, and you would end often at the same point, but you would come there from different directions. And the discussions would start with things like, well, how many combinations of hand positions are there really? And how many combinations of foot positions are there really? And I was studying Pomor at the time, and Pomor has this very amazing thing they call Matsukan Kaki. Well, they just call it Matsukan, but for us it's Matsukan Kaki. And it's a category of entries. And they also have categories of olives. And that works really well with the way my mind works, right? Because it helps to sort of define like how to think about how to define the system the way that they did anyway. So it would be like, you can evade by jumping. You can evade by jumping on one foot. You can evade by stepping to the left. You can evade by stepping, backwards. You can, and so on. And so they have all these categories. And so they, that sort of helped. And then they're like, we have these foot entries, and these foot entries, which is the Matsukan, are pretty specific positions in relationship to another person. And that was the epiphany for me, because it was like, at the end of the day, not only had I not really been exposed to a system that so clearly defined the lower relationship of the body, but they had it categorized and sorted out. And interestingly enough, they don't do it on the upper body the same way. They just do it on the lower body. And so for me, the epiphany was like, I can do that on the upper body too. And so when I started, that's how I started. And basically, PSP for me, Penchak Silat Patamperan, which means combat of many. My goal has always been to create something that's absolutely martial and will allow art. So it isn't art for art's sake. It is, the purpose to me is to make beautiful what is martial. And so when you get into Pomor, they have this one, this structure, and you think, oh my gosh, I can do that with hands, and thereby sort of answering the question of, well, how many positions are there, right? Well, the positions aren't positions you have, they're positions that you have with a person. So everything then becomes based on relationship. And if you can define, basic relationships on it with someone, basically, then you can define the techniques that would automatically come from that, because there's only so many in some cases. For example, you step forward with your right leg and your right foot to strike, and I step forward with my right leg and my right foot to counter. Now, my right leg can go in front of your leg, or it can go behind your leg. Seems pretty obvious. Well, my right hand can either go below your hand or it can go above your hand. And that's pretty much it. And then my left hand could also do the same thing from both inside and outside. So you end up with a pretty quickly defined process for sorting through your techniques. And then when you look at all the systems that are out there and you look at what's universally happening, I mean, in a general sense anyway, for example, many arts have the hammerlock and the hammerlock takedown. Well, obviously the takedown isn't the issue, it's the hammerlock, because the hammerlock takedown flows out of the hammerlock. So the hammerlock's not the issue if you can't get the relationship. So if you sort through that chain, then that's basically what PSP is like sorting through the chain and building the chain from start to finish and trying to do it in a time-sensitive manner that takes into account what the other guy's doing, what the other person's doing. So, for example, you can have the best technique in the world, but if it takes 4 movements to a person's 1 movement, it's probably not going to happen. If you can make that a one-to-one relationship, then it's more likely to happen. And I know that because I've been hit many, many times by people when I've tried to do things that took too long. So that's kind of the process of PSP and how it came to be as a system. As far as being sorted out, I mean, I'm still sorting it out, to be honest. You know, I continue to learn. The first real major curriculum at PSP was, I would say now looking back at it, I would say it's still me not having a clear enough idea of what my end goals were. And having a lot of sort of extra baggage from, you know, things that you like versus things that you need. And as much as possible, I'm trying to do things that I need, of course, to simplify. So it's really been a process of simplification over the years. And I would say right now I'm in an iteration of the system that is mostly focused on how do I teach it? Like, is the structure structured for me as a teacher, or is the structure structured for a person learning it? And this last iteration, I think, is really getting to the place where it's mostly structured for learning it, and that's really where we need to be.
Now, Sean, I know from conversations with you off air, there is an entirely different aspect to this art that does not involve physical combat. And I would like to know if you could tell me about, you know, your perspectives on warriorship and just living life and how your Silat relates to that.
Sure. Well, you know, like I said, I mean, for me, the biggest revelation was understanding that this thing we do isn't about what Sean thinks should happen. Because at the end of the day, it has to take into consideration what the other person's doing. And that, of course, just means a relationship, right? We have wives and children and girlfriends and bosses and everybody else, and those are all just relationships and all the same thing. But we try to separate them, or we don't think about it one way or the other. And in reality, they're very similar, if not identical in process, you know. When I'm fighting somebody, ultimately, let's say I'm performing a takedown. Now, there's a couple ways I can get there, right? I get in, I enter, and I can put myself in a position which will not upset the opponent's balance, or I can put myself in a position that upsets the opponent's balance. If I don't upset their balance, obviously, I'm off balance, right? I mean, at least generally. And so they're able to take advantage of me. Likewise, if I put them off balance, then I'm able to take advantage of the situation. I can't control what they do. I don't know if they'll respond or they won't respond. But what I can be sure about is what I do. So I have a choice to act or react. And as much as possible, I try to get people to understand that they have the choice to act versus react. Now, we put ourselves out there, you know, if people talk about self-defense, for example. And frankly, I hate that term. I just find the whole concept to be completely off-center. If you're trying to respond in a self-defense situation, you are being defensive and you are being put in a position that is behind in timing. And what you really need to do is figure out how to be offensive. And the way to do that is to set yourself up to be neutral to begin with. If you can set yourself up to be neutral to begin with, then you have the option of becoming offensive at any time. And that means, controlling your emotions. That means controlling your position. That means controlling the angle. That means controlling outcomes of yourself. Now, what the other person does, you don't always have any control over. So, if I hit you one way or another, you're going to move some way. I have an idea what it could be, but I don't actually know until it happens. So that means I have to be adaptable, and I have to act, and you have to build this kind of character in your life where you're able to kind of roll with the punches and figure out what's coming next and how to move and how to respond. You have a choice on how you respond to anger and frustration. You have a choice on how you respond to happiness, and you have a choice on how you respond to, losing your job and or getting a pay raise. Right? It doesn't always have to be negative stuff. So for example, you could get a pay raise and immediately go out and get drunk and get in a car accident or get a DUI. So, there's never a time when you shouldn't be acting out, in a way that makes sense. So, if you're completely driven by a reaction, then you're just in the wind. You don't have any real say in your life. You're just a responsive person. So, and of course, by itself, of course, is a setup for a certain amount of failures because you don't take ownership for yourself. And so, that's how I look at it, right? You can fight and you can, in order to do the best kind of fighting, you should be constantly setting up situations that put you in a better position. Or you can have no control over it, and when you get hit, you curl up into a ball and you forget your training, and then you're just in the middle of chaos. Which is, they're both self-making. It's just choosing that you're not going to do that, and you're going to recover into something you know versus something you don't know. And we all struggle with those decisions every day.
And Sean, can you tell me, with your students and the people that are part of your community, these lessons, are they something that is, spoken about on a very open level? Are you making a point to make these illustrations to the students, or is this something that the students kind of get little by little, kind of through osmosis from being around you and being in the classroom with you?
I think it's both, and I mean, I've written 3 books. The first 2 books are, they point to some of that, but they're more the mechanics and the technical side. But the third book is pretty much all of that. That's all it is kind of looking at life a little different, a little more philosophically, tying principles of movement and principles of training, all that with life principles. And spiritual principles, and trying to point to it at least. I wouldn't say it's the best attempt. It's one of those books that I would love to get another chance to rewrite, because it was actually the most difficult. It's the smallest book with the least amount of pages and the most difficult to write, because I really had to pick through how, it all connects in all these different areas, because it's my personal belief that principles that we follow in martial arts are universal principles. And there, of course, are exceptions to that. And they can work, but they aren't the rule. They're the exception. And so, if they're universal rules, they apply in different ways throughout life. Sometimes it's, the difference of creative versus destructive, but it's still a principle that exists. And so I had the book, but then as people come to me with different topics and different discussions, I will obviously highlight things I see. This weekend we did a street offense workshop down in Florida, and mentioned in there, talking about relationships. Like you have no control over your girlfriend, your wife, your whatever, right? But you have every ability to control yourself and how you respond to it. So if you miss that, then I don't see how you, as a martial artist, are ever going to have have the control to know whether or not you should engage somebody. You know, if we say, oh, don't let ego drive you, don't engage this guy just because he's in your face screaming at you, but you can't do it with your wife or your kids or your girlfriend or your boss, then I don't see how you're ever going to do it with a guy who's screaming at you, spitting at you, calling you names, swearing at you, right? So it's all the same thing. We just have to figure it out. And so I do that constantly as we're training. But I think it's a both and answer.
Now, Sean, it sounds like you're trying to, help instill in your students a sense of, what's right and what's wrong and the right way to go about, achieving what's correct and making good decisions. Like you said, putting yourself constantly in a better position. Now, and this is a very personal question, but right and wrong is often very, very subjective. And it, can vary from culture to culture, from person to person. For you, on a personal level, what's your yardstick? What's the framework that you're coming from as far as being able to decide what is right and what is wrong, and being able to put markers, in the sand to look at that and look at how you're going to analyze your behavior and your thoughts and actions?
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, I came actually from a Christian background, but I don't think that's an exclusive, point of view. So, I mean, I have used that as my basis because that's my background, but that's not everybody's background, and that's not everybody's background that I teach for sure. And so I talk about it in different ways. For example, if you want to really use PSP, Penchart, Silat, combat Silat, whatever you want to call it, or you want to use Fernand's own fighting system, whatever it is. Whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. At some point, you have to develop faith in it. And it doesn't have to be blind faith. It has to be tried and tested faith, right? There has to come a point when you go, I believe in this. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it even when I get smacked in the face. Because at the end of the day, you're going to get smacked in the face. You're going to get kicked. You're going to get cut by the knife, right? Like, I hope that doesn't happen. But let's look at it and say, okay, the way that I train, everything is set up to fail, right? So we train as though everything is, we train the things that we think will succeed, expecting it to fail so that we're always ready to kind of keep going and to move on. We do that through setting ourselves up for the next thing, right? It's not because we got, oh, woe is me, I'm never going to succeed. That isn't the point. The point is, I'm going to do my best to make this thing work. If it doesn't work, I'm still going to be set up to do something else. And that's kind of our approach. And we have a saying called Wantadari Batu Te Batu, which means stepping from stone to stone. And that's kind of the approach, right? So, it isn't that there's a right or a wrong answer. The right answer is the answer that works relative to what's happening. And, for the longest time as a Christian, I always dealt with this issue, right? So I came from Catholic to Pentecostal to I've been evangelical, whatever. So I've been around the block a little bit in that, and I've studied Zen Buddhism and several other things. But what has always come back to me is, somebody will say, oh, absolute truth doesn't exist, whatever. So I've had these conversations literally with everybody at some point. And I'll say, well, that's not true. Like, at the end of the day, if I punch you in the face, that's true, right? Like, I mean, what's the dispute? The dispute is whether or not I can do it again. Okay, that is what's not absolutely true. What has happened is absolutely true. And what's happening is absolutely true. What's not happening, what isn't absolutely true is what could happen. So, excuse me for that. I've been talking all day, so I have sort of a dry throat. But anyway, so I look at the context of things, and I draw from them, based on my own experience. But it isn't really about, in application anyway, it isn't about this is the right technique and this is the wrong technique as such, because the right technique is always going to be based on the relationship you have, right? How I live with my wife is not going to be the relationship you have with your wife, right? And it shouldn't be. And so we have to be able to navigate that every day in every situation. Are we always going to be successful? Of course not. That's exactly the point, right? The point is to be able to self-correct and to find a starting point that you can work from. So when you have those moments where no matter what you do, it doesn't seem like it's going to work out, how do you self-correct? And it always means going back to something known and starting again. And, for a sense of justice versus, for me, that's coming from probably a Christian background primarily. I mean, I'm in the U.S., so a majority of what we do is based on that. But it's not exclusive to that. I mean, Muslims have a sense of justice. It's different than ours in some ways. Jews have a sense of justice. Many cultures have justice set into their thing. So I don't prescribe what the justice is for a student so much as I basically try to give them a framework to find ways to find it for themselves.
Now, Sean, other than getting into the state of Florida to come take some classes with you, what are the ways that are available to people if they want to come out, train with you, learn the material, learn your approach to Silat? What's available to people out there?
Well, I'm actually in North Carolina now. I've been here for about a year and a half. I'm starting in that process of creating an online training program. That's been something I've been slow to do. I've been watching other people do it and kind of seeing where it goes. I have DVDs, I have books. The purpose of those is not to demonstrate how cool I am. I mean, I've had people straight up say, "Oh, that's kind of boring." It's like, well, that's good. I guess I'd rather they were boring than flashy and thin. So they're just strictly curriculum teaching. And my point in all of the materials I create has always been to make it available to people. Because, I told you as a kid growing up, my parents divorced and we didn't really have money, so I couldn't really train. And so it's always been really on my heart to make sure that martial arts is available to people, because I'd wanted to do it ever since I was a really young boy and just didn't have the means. And so when I first set out to doing this, I got criticized by a lot of people. I'm sure I probably still do. I don't really care. The point for me has always been to make it available to people who want to learn and don't want or can't afford the expense of bringing instructors in and stuff. I went through that. It isn't cheap. I brought instructors back and forth for years, and it was worth it, but it was also expensive. It took time and money away from my family, and so I try to make it available. So I have this online course right now, which I'm pretty excited about, actually, because for the first time I'm able to put the books alongside of the video, which is always the intent with the stuff that I created, so that a person can actually read it and see it, because I know that people learn differently. So having the option of putting it all together seems like kind of a no-brainer. So that's the biggest way right now. Of course, they can do seminars with me and, come here and train and whatever. So I'm available. It's really just got to be on somebody's want-to-do list, and they'll figure it out.
And Sean, can you give us the website address or the best, contact email or phone number for you?
Sure. Well, my website is www.combat-silat.net or silat.us. And then my email is info@combat-silat.net. And my number is 321-402-6811. And if you call me, definitely leave a message, because if you don't, I'm not going to call you back. I get a lot of calls, so it's not going to happen if you don't leave a message.
Great. Well, Sean, I want to thank you for being on the show with us. I thank you for giving us some insight into the art that you teach and practice, and we hopefully will have you back on the show in the near future.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, it's been my pleasure, sir. Thank you very much.